A little girl whispers, "My hair hurts, please," and a millionaire father rushes into a home suddenly full of tension. Scissors clutched tightly in trembling hands reveal a fear deeper than he imagined. Every trace of hair, every displaced object tells a silent story of distress he never noticed. The mansion, once a sanctuary, has become a labyrinth of hidden corners and quiet desperation. What he discovers next could change the fragile balance between trust and fear forever. The words were barely audible, a fragile plea suspended in the dim light of the corridor. They carried an urgency that demanded attention, yet they were delivered in a way that betrayed vulnerability, hesitation, and fear. Everett's chest tightened instantly as he processed the meaning behind the utterance. His mind raced. She had been safe moments ago, but now the tone of her voice, the broken cadence of her plea, indicated a distress that could no longer be ignored. It was the kind of cry that stripped the familiarity from a home, replacing it with a tense uncertainty that made every step he took heavier and more deliberate. He moved quickly down the hallway, eyes scanning for the source. The polished floors reflected the dim glow of the overhead lights, but shadows lingered in the corners, making the expansive rooms feel tighter, more confining. Each photograph, each carefully arranged piece of furniture, seemed to recede into insignificance as he focused entirely on the sound of her voice and the urgency it carried. The whisper repeated softly, almost indistinguishable yet painfully clear, the pain in her tone, the subtle catch in her breath, the way her plea fractured in mid-word, all painted a vivid portrait of her current state. As he approached the bedroom door, the familiar scent of home mingled with something slightly acrid, burnt hair. Overheated hairbrush. Everett couldn't pinpoint it, but the scent added to the tension building inside him. He placed a hand on the door handle, pausing for a brief second to collect himself. The polished wood beneath his fingers was cool, unyielding, a barrier between him and the child whose distress had shattered the calm of his meticulously maintained mansion. He drew a deep breath, forcing his pulse to steady, and pushed the door open carefully, prepared to confront the unknown. The scene inside the room seized him immediately. His daughter sat on the small rug near the center, her legs folded beneath her, hands trembling violently. In her grasp were the scissors, shiny, small, and pointed toward the floor in a position that suggested she had raised them instinctively to shield herself. Her dark brown hair, slightly tangled from the struggle, fell partially over her face, and faint streaks of tears glimmered along her cheeks. The room, once familiar and comforting, now seemed charged with the tension of fear, isolation, and misunderstood intent. Every object, the neatly arranged dresser, the nightstand with its small lamp, the carefully placed toys, stood in stark contrast to the chaos of her small, trembling frame. Everett's eyes tracked the fine details of the scene. He noticed the scattered strands of hair across the rug and floorboards, small tufts that suggested repeated attempts at self-soothing or coping. He noted the subtle crease in the fabric of her pajama sleeves, the faint marks where her small hands had pressed against the rug as if bracing herself. Each tiny detail was a silent testament to the depth of her discomfort and the isolation she had felt even in a space meant for safety. The soft glow from the lamp highlighted the subtle sheen of sweat along her temple, evidence of the physical tension and emotional strain she had endured. His mind flashed backward, recalling evenings when he had rushed through the hallway without checking in, distracted by meetings, calls, or trivial tasks that had seemed urgent at the time. He had believed she was safe, that her quiet demeanor meant contentment or independence. Now, faced with the image of her fragile, trembling body, he realized the truth had been present all along, signs he had ignored, dismissed, or never noticed because he had not paused long enough to look. The scissors in her hands were not instruments of defiance but symbols of fear, tiny shields she wielded in a world that suddenly felt unsafe. Everett bent slightly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might escalate her anxiety. He studied her expression, the wide, panicked eyes that darted toward the corner of the room, the quivering lips that had barely formed the words, the subtle tremor in her shoulders. Her gaze flickered between him and the object in her hands, uncertainty mingling with the faint hope that he would understand before any harm could come to her. The room felt smaller now, every detail amplified by the intensity of the moment, the dull reflection of the lamp on the polished floor, the shadows cast across the walls, the faint scent of hair products mingled with stress and fear. The mansion's silence, once a mark of comfort, now seemed oppressive. It amplified the tremor in her hands, the uneven breaths escaping her chest, and the soft whimpering that occasionally punctuated her plea. Everett realized that the very environment he had built to protect her, wide rooms, isolated corners, distant hallways, had contributed to the weight of her fear. Each element of the space, from the high ceilings to the muted lighting, now seemed capable of magnifying the intensity of her distress rather than mitigating it. He inched forward, assessing the situation, aware that any sudden move could trigger panic. His focus narrowed entirely to the small, trembling figure before him. The scissors were still raised slightly, an unconscious barrier against perceived danger, and his heart ached as he recognized the depth of her fear. She was not defiant, not mischievous, not careless. She was trying to communicate vulnerability in the only way she knew how. Everett's mind raced to reconcile his previous assumptions with this newfound reality. The quiet whispers, the scattered hair, the trembling hands, they all spoke of a child desperately seeking comfort in the presence of the very person she trusted most. Every instinct urged him to act gently, to lower her defenses without forcing contact too quickly. The room, though familiar, was now charged with an invisible energy, a mixture of fear, relief, and the anticipation of understanding. Everett knelt slightly, bringing himself to her level, careful not to loom over her. The soft glow of the lamp highlighted the moisture in her eyes and the tiny streaks of hair across her small hands, each detail a reminder of the vulnerability he had overlooked. And then, as he leaned just enough to reach toward her, the full extent of her fear crystallized. Her hands trembled violently around the scissors, raising the metallic tips slightly higher than before, as though anticipating a threat that was simultaneously real and imagined. Every subtle movement, the curl of her fingers, the tension in her arms, the quiver in her shoulders, spoke volumes about the intensity of her emotions, and the urgency for him to respond correctly, calmly, and compassionately. He sees her tiny hands clutching the scissors, trembling in fear. The bedroom, once a space of warmth and security, had shifted overnight into a silent chamber of tension. The soft hum of the nightlight no longer comforted. Instead, it highlighted shadows that clung to corners, giving weight to every subtle movement. Everett moved cautiously across the threshold, his eyes scanning the room, taking in details he had long overlooked. The small rug beneath his daughter's feet, the neatly arranged dresser, the nightstand with its tiny lamp, all of it now seemed charged, tense, as though the very air was aware of the fragility contained within. Each breath she drew seemed amplified, and with it, the room itself seemed to hold its own, waiting, anticipating, bracing for the next movement. Her small body sat near the center, trembling slightly as her hands clutched the scissors. She was curled just enough to protect herself, but her head tilted toward the faint light, an unconscious invitation for him to understand her pain without imposing. Her dark brown hair, tangled and slightly streaked with faint traces of soot from earlier misadventures, fell in loose strands over her forehead and shoulders. The small lines of tension along her jaw and the subtle rise and fall of her chest told him more than words ever could. This was a child deeply distressed, seeking comfort while simultaneously shielding herself from perceived danger. Everett's gaze swept across the room, taking in the familiar objects that now seemed almost foreign in their arrangement. The toy chest, usually overflowing with cheerful colors, now seemed a barrier she used instinctively to distance herself from the vastness of the space. Her small chair, tucked neatly against the wall, bore no signs of use tonight. Instead, the room felt empty except for her presence, a small island of tension within the broader calm of the environment. The polished floors reflected faint light, casting soft glimmers across scattered items, but those glimmers did nothing to break the suffocating sense of unease. He noticed the subtle signs of her previous attempts to manage her discomfort. Her pajama sleeves were rolled slightly above the wrist, revealing small, tremulous hands that had pressed against the rug and the nearby dresser for support. The nightlight illuminated small indentations on the carpet where she had shifted back and forth, trying to find a position that offered comfort. Everett's mind raced as he pieced together the story the room was quietly telling him. This was a child attempting to navigate her distress alone, using the limited resources at her disposal to create a sense of control. The air was slightly warmer here than the hallway had been, a subtle consequence of the nightlight and the lack of ventilation in the space. That warmth, however, did not soothe her. Instead, it seemed to press against her, highlighting the vulnerability of her small frame. Everett understood that every object in the room, every shadow, every reflected line of light had become part of the narrative she was creating silently, an environment that mirrored her internal state. Even the neatly made bed, with its plush comforter, seemed to accentuate the contrast between his expectations of safety and her lived experience of unease. He moved slowly, careful not to make sudden gestures that might escalate her anxiety. His gaze fell upon the dresser first. The drawers were closed, handles polished and aligned perfectly. Yet the smooth surface bore tiny impressions, barely visible in the dim light, small depressions where her fingers had pressed or tugged, perhaps in moments of panic or frustration. He knelt slightly to examine them, his mind racing with the realization that she had not merely reacted to the presence of scissors, she had been attempting, in small, almost imperceptible ways, to manage her world for some time. The room itself had become a repository of those small signals, a map of emotional distress hidden beneath the surface of domestic perfection. Everett's attention shifted to the floor. His eyes traced subtle variations in the carpet fibers, slight differences in shadow that suggested movement, pauses and shifts, hesitations that spoke to her struggle to balance fear with the desire to be found, acknowledged, and understood. The rug had absorbed the weight of her small body many times tonight, a silent witness to her oscillation between hiding and seeking reassurance. Each subtle shift revealed a deeper truth. She had been attempting to navigate her environment, managing her fear through precise, quiet movements, with no words to guide him. The scattered toys and personal objects that usually provided comfort now seemed inert, as though aware that the usual role had been usurped by the pressing immediacy of her distress. Her hairbrush lay untouched, yet traces of hair on the floor indicated previous attempts to self-soothe or adjust her appearance without permission or guidance. Everett's heart sank as he processed this. Each fragment, each small strand, was a physical manifestation of the emotional burden she carried alone. The room, designed for protection and play, had become a stage for her silent struggle, a struggle that had been invisible until this moment. Everett's gaze moved toward the small window near the corner. The moonlight filtered softly through the curtain, casting a pale line across the polished floor. That light seemed to stretch toward her, offering a path of visibility and connection. Her eyes flickered toward it instinctively, not fully aware of its symbolic significance, but responding to the subconscious need for orientation, for grounding, for a point of reference in a world that had grown too large and too unpredictable. He realized that the room itself, with its familiar arrangement, could not provide comfort without his active intervention. The physical space alone was insufficient to meet her needs. The scissors in her hands caught the faint reflection of the moonlight. They were small, delicate, yet their metallic edges drew attention to the fragility of the moment. Her grip was tight, trembling, not in defiance, but in instinctive self-protection. Every subtle motion, every flicker of fear across her expression, was amplified by the tension in the room, creating a suspended atmosphere in which time itself seemed to slow. Everett understood that this was the point where presence mattered more than words, where his careful observation and measured reaction could transform fear into reassurance. As he crouched slightly, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening, his eyes followed the floor closer to her. Something subtle caught his attention, faint, irregular lines, almost imperceptible unless one looked carefully. There were tiny fragments of hair scattered across the carpet, some short, some longer, forming a delicate trail. The placement suggested repeated self-soothing, attempts to manage her distress through minor adjustments to her hair, strands that had been clipped or tugged during moments of tension. The realization struck him with sudden force. She had been trying to cope silently, using whatever tools she had at hand, while the environment and he had failed to notice. The scattered hair, the trembling scissors, the tension in her posture, and the silent aura of the room combined to form a tableau that demanded immediate understanding. Everett's mind raced as he prepared to bridge the gap between fear and comfort, realizing that the smallest, most careful movement could determine whether trust would be restored or further shaken. Every detail, the indentations in the carpet, the subtle movements of her fingers, the glimmering strands of hair, the way the shadows pulled in the corners, spoke to him about the hours she had spent navigating her distress alone. He notices small snips of hair scattered across the floor. Everett's eyes lingered on the scissors in his daughter's trembling hands, their metallic edges catching the faint glow from the nightlight and reflecting a spectrum of urgency and fragility. They were ordinary in appearance, small and designed for delicate cutting, yet in this moment they transcended the utilitarian purpose. To him, they had become a language of distress, a signal louder than any words she could muster. The scissors were her protest, her silent plea for attention, her declaration that something in her world had become too overwhelming to endure alone. The polished blades gleamed faintly, but the tension emanating from her hands told the story. They were not weapons, yet they communicated fear in a way nothing else could. The room seemed to hold its breath around them, its familiar objects now imbued with emotional weight. Everett's gaze swept from the scissors to the scattered strands of hair on the rug and floor, each fragment forming a subtle trail that spoke of repeated attempts at self-soothing. Some pieces were tiny, barely a half-inch in length, others were longer, hinting at moments of panic when she tugged or snipped impulsively. The meticulous arrangement of the furniture, a bed neatly made, a dresser lined perfectly, contrasted sharply with the chaos of her personal coping strategies, emphasizing the quiet intensity of her struggle. The scissors had become extensions of her emotions, physical representations of frustration, pain, and the desperate need to be heard. Everett's mind raced as he considered the implications. The blades themselves were not dangerous in their intent, yet their presence indicated something far deeper, a child attempting to control an uncontrollable situation. The scissors had been lifted and poised, trembling, signaling both discomfort and an unconscious attempt to create agency within her constrained environment. Each subtle movement, each shift in her grip, revealed her internal struggle in ways words never could. The room, with its muted colors and orderly arrangement, had become a stage for this silent performance, where fear manifested in delicate metal and scattered hair. He crouched slightly to bring himself closer to her level, careful not to startle or impose. The nightlight cast long, soft shadows across the floor, highlighting the texture of the rug and the fine strands of hair that led toward the edge of the room. Each line, each cluster of cut or pulled hair, was a breadcrumb in the narrative she had been crafting alone. They were more than signs of distress, they were markers of time, evidence of the moments she had spent navigating her fears within the confines of a room that should have been safe. Everett understood, with growing intensity, that these small fragments were her attempt to communicate, to leave a trail that could guide someone to understanding if only someone looked closely enough. His gaze followed the trail carefully, noting the pattern in the distribution of the hair. It was not random. The strands curved subtly toward the corner of the room, toward the dresser, and finally arced toward the partially open closet. The pathway suggested both hesitation and determination. She had moved deliberately, attempting to find refuge while simultaneously signaling her discomfort. Each step along the trail revealed her internal negotiation between fear and the desire for safety. Everett recognized that the scissors were not the solution she sought, they were merely a tool in the broader context of her silent struggle. The lighting in the room accentuated every detail. The polished floorboards reflected the muted glow from the lamp, giving subtle prominence to the small, dark lines of hair. Shadows stretched from the furniture, pulling in corners and along the edges of the rug, creating a visual tension that mirrored the emotional tension of the scene. Everett's eyes adjusted slowly, tracking each element with meticulous care. He saw the way the scissors rested lightly against her fingers, the slight curl of her wrist, the faint tremor in her forearms. It was a language in motion, a signal she had relied upon for lack of another outlet. He moved closer to the trail of hair, noting how it gently led toward the closet door, which was ajar by only a few inches. The gap was narrow, but wide enough to suggest intentional movement. Her footsteps had carried her here in deliberate, measured motions, and the hair strands followed her path with precise irregularity. Each piece of hair seemed to record a moment of indecision, a pause where she had stopped to breathe, to clutch the scissors, and to assess the safety of the surrounding environment. Everett realized that the scissors had been both a comfort and a warning, a tool through which she could express her fear without risk of verbal misunderstanding. The closet itself now became the focus of his attention. The door, partially open, revealed only a sliver of shadowed interior, hinting at the possibilities of hidden refuge or further tension. Everett noted the subtle indentation in the carpet leading toward the opening, confirming the trajectory suggested by the hair. The closet's interior, dimly lit and obscured, had become a small chamber of both risk and protection. The space was not designed for comfort, yet it offered concealment, allowing her to feel in control of her immediate environment. The scissors had guided her here, the hair had marked the passage, and the room held the residual tension of her movement. Everett's focus alternated between the child and the pathway of hair. Each cluster, each fragment, carried a dual message, one of vulnerability, one of urgent need. The scissors were not simply an object, they were the instrument through which she expressed both distress and agency. Everett realized that in this moment, the scissors spoke louder than any cry or whispered word. They embodied the convergence of fear, frustration, and the instinct to protect oneself in a space that should have been safe. Every detail, the angle of the blades, the tremor in her grip, the scattered hair, was part of a narrative that demanded attentive, deliberate response. The room's tension was palpable, almost as if the walls themselves recognized the significance of the moment. Everett adjusted his stance slightly, keeping his movements slow and measured to avoid startling her. The faint rustle of her clothing, the slight shifting of her feet, and the subtle reflection of light off the scissors created an intricate choreography of emotion, movement, and intent. Everett understood that any misstep could disrupt this fragile balance, and that careful observation and controlled action were crucial in guiding her safely out of the state of distress. His gaze returned to the hair strands on the floor. They were leading unmistakably toward the closet, a silent, physical representation of her choice and instinct. Each piece documented the progression of her emotional state, hesitation, small victories, adjustments to maintain safety, and the persistent presence of the scissors as both shield and signal. Everett's heart pounded as he recognized the significance. The path of hair was not just evidence of distress, but an active call for intervention, a map showing exactly where his presence was needed. Everett's mind traced the path slowly, noting how each strand gently converged toward the closet opening. He could almost see her small, cautious steps, the careful placement of each foot, the subtle pauses to reassess her environment. The scissors, raised lightly in her grip, indicated a combination of defensiveness and readiness to retreat further if her attempt to be understood failed. The air in the room seemed charged, dense with tension, as though it anticipated the critical moment when Everett would act, bridging the space between observation and intervention. The hair on the floor leads toward the closet, partially open. Everett Caldwell froze for a moment as he observed the scattered hair and the partially open closet. The scissors in her tiny hands were no longer merely an object, they were the culmination of countless small signs he had failed to notice over the years. The weight of realization pressed into his chest, heavy and inescapable. Memories flooded in, unbidden yet vivid, each one a reminder of how distracted he had been by the demands of his career, the endless meetings, the global calls, the late nights spent chasing success. Each moment he had believed he was providing for her had, in fact, created the space for her quiet struggles to go unseen. He remembered mornings when she had lingered silently in the hallway, trying to catch his attention as he rushed past in a flurry of suits and briefcases. He recalled the soft footsteps behind him, the small rustle of clothing that he had assumed were merely incidental. At the time, her hesitations, her pauses, her subtle signals had seemed inconsequential. Now, standing in this charged bedroom, he recognized the significance of each ignored gesture. Every quiet attempt to communicate her discomfort, every flicker of hesitation in her expression, had been a cry for recognition that he had failed to perceive. The visions of those overlooked moments were relentless, pressing into him with the clarity of hindsight. He saw her small hands, reaching out, grasping for connection in the simplest ways, holding a hairbrush too tightly, tugging at her strands as if trying to manipulate her environment to feel some control, arranging small toys in precise formations to mark her territory. She had been attempting, in every subtle act, to create stability in a house that felt too large, too orderly, and too silent to accommodate her needs. The quiet desperation embedded in these gestures became painfully clear, each one a breadcrumb that he had walked past without comprehension. Everett's gaze shifted to the pillow on her bed. The soft fabric bore faint impressions, small depressions that suggested repeated pressure and tugging. He leaned closer, noting the subtle distortions in the cloth. The faint tug mark was almost invisible, yet it spoke volumes. It indicated moments when she had sought comfort by manipulating her immediate environment, seeking relief from discomfort that had gone unaddressed. The pillow had absorbed her attempts to ease tension, to find some reprieve from the overwhelming sensations she faced in silence. He recalled nights when he had arrived home exhausted, assuming the house was quiet and his daughter was resting peacefully. He now understood that the silence he valued had often been the sound of her containment, an invisible, weighty manifestation of fear, stress, and unmet needs. The cozy bedroom, carefully arranged and meticulously clean, had masked the emotional turmoil she carried. The order of the room had not reflected her comfort but instead concealed the ongoing struggle, each object hiding traces of distress that demanded a patient, observant eye. The scattered hair strands across the floor were not isolated incidents, they were evidence of countless small episodes in which she had attempted to navigate her own discomfort. He saw, in memory, the subtle patterns of her behavior, tugging at her hair during quiet moments in the living room, brushing stray strands over her shoulders, clutching hair clips and combs with a protective instinct he had misinterpreted as play. Each act had been a form of communication, a silent plea for attention and care, signaling a discomfort she could not yet articulate in words. Everett's reflection turned inward, and he felt a tightening in his chest. The realization that his focus on productivity, on work, and on maintaining appearances had blinded him to her silent pleas was overwhelming. Every flashback compounded the sense of urgency, the mornings he had ignored her hesitation, the afternoons he had walked past her quietly arranged toys, the evenings when he had assumed her contentment was genuine simply because she made no noise. He had failed to notice the slow accumulation of tension, the subtle signals that now converged into a clear narrative of distress. The pillow drew his attention once more. The faint tug mark, slightly frayed along the edge of the fabric, suggested repeated attempts to manipulate it for comfort. He imagined her small hands pressing, pulling, kneading, and arranging the soft material to create a sense of relief in an environment that had been far too imposing. Each indentation was a testament to her quiet resilience, to her attempts at self-soothing in the absence of adult recognition. He realized that her struggle had been ongoing, methodical, and deeply emotional, hidden behind the orderly facade of a room he had assumed to be safe. Everett's mind returned to the closet, the partially open door and the shadowed interior suggesting that her next refuge had been prepared long before tonight. The hair on the floor, the tug marks, and the scissors were all part of a sequence he now understood, a pattern of behavior shaped by the mismatch between her needs and his attention. The child had been managing her fear and discomfort in precise ways, seeking control and stability where the home structure failed to provide it. Each movement she had made, each subtle adjustment to her environment, formed a silent message that only now he could read. He understood finally that the bedroom, with all its familiar furniture, polished floors, and orderly arrangement, had not been a safe haven until he truly observed her. Her attempts to gain comfort had been invisible, encoded in minor disturbances and slight imprints, until the scissors became both a tool and a signal, and the hair strands formed a visible trail he could no longer ignore. The combination of these details created a map of her fear, frustration, and need for connection, and the realization weighed heavily upon him. Everett's gaze lingered on the pillow one last time, tracing the faint lines and subtle impressions left by her repeated movements. The delicate tug marks were more than evidence of physical interaction, they were symbolic of a child's attempt to carve out safety in a world that felt too overwhelming. Each impression represented moments of vulnerability, moments he had missed, moments that now demanded immediate understanding. The room, previously ordinary, now felt alive with memory, charged with the weight of unobserved struggle. He leaned slightly, preparing to follow the next clue, the hair strands leading toward the closet. The room had spoken through its objects, shadows, and minute disturbances. The sequence was undeniable, the scattered hair, the tug marks, the trembling scissors, they all indicated movement, emotion, and need. He realized that to intervene effectively, he had to act with precision, empathy, and recognition, tracing the physical evidence back to its emotional source. A faint tug mark on the pillow suggests repeated attempts to escape discomfort. Everett's attention shifted from the faint tug mark on the pillow to the broader landscape of the mansion. Each hallway, each room, and each corner suddenly carried new significance. What had once seemed like a vast, empty house filled with elegant decor and polished floors now transformed into a labyrinth of potential refuge. He realized that she had been navigating this expanse with a delicate strategy, seeking out the smallest, most obscure spaces to feel safe. The sprawling rooms, which had always impressed visitors and friends, had become overwhelming for a child, and in response, she had claimed the hidden nooks that offered her control, concealment, and quiet. He remembered the attic, the bathroom, the spaces beneath the stairs, and even behind furniture where shadows pulled naturally. She had learned to identify areas that minimized sensory input, corners where walls compressed the air, spaces that limited exposure to overwhelming stimuli, and positions that allowed her to feel the solid presence of the floor beneath her without needing interaction. These were the hiding spots she chose deliberately, with instinctive knowledge of their effect on her emotional state. Each location had been a sanctuary where she could breathe, slow her racing thoughts, and regain a sense of mastery over her environment. Everett crouched down to examine one particularly narrow passage along the hallway. Dust clung lightly to the edges of the molding, disturbed only in the faintest arcs by a small hand. Tiny scratches on the floorboards indicated repeated movement into the same corner, evidence of careful, deliberate navigation. His chest tightened as he imagined her small figure moving silently along this path, hands brushing walls and furniture, seeking the comfort of familiar shapes, textures, and shadows. The mansion, once a place of opulence and admiration, had inadvertently shaped a world of isolated sanctuaries for a child struggling to reconcile fear with safety. He traced the pattern of her movements across several rooms. Beneath the desk in his study, a faint indentation in the rug suggested she had crouched there to escape the overwhelming sensation of open space. Behind the laundry room door, the air had likely carried less echo, less movement, less stimulation. The corner near the staircase offered both concealment and the reassurance of structure, walls enclosing her in a way that mimicked the safety of an embrace without requiring human contact. Everett began to understand that her strategy was consistent, intelligent, and born of necessity. Each hiding spot represented a moment of survival, a refuge in which she could regain equilibrium until she felt prepared to emerge. The subtle patterns he noticed were not random. They formed a spatial map of the mansion through the eyes of a child conditioned to avoid discomfort and maximize security. Shadows became protective barriers, furniture served as partial shields, and narrow gaps provided both control and invisibility. Everett realized that the previously inconspicuous spaces he had ignored for years were critical to her experience of safety. The mansion's expanse, which to him signified freedom and luxury, had been a constant challenge to her sense of security, prompting the creation of small, intimate sanctuaries scattered throughout. As he followed the faint impressions of her presence, he noticed the small tuft of hair clinging to the base of a bookshelf. It was subtle, almost invisible against the dark wood, yet it immediately signaled her recent proximity. The hair, like the traces he had seen earlier, the scattered strands on the rug, the pulled bits near the pillow, was more than mere evidence. It was a symbol of her passage, a physical manifestation of both her movement and her emotional state. Everett leaned closer, careful not to disturb it, and realized that each detail he observed told the story of a child negotiating spaces for control, comfort, and concealment in a house too vast to navigate emotionally. He imagined her small body pressing against the walls, shoulders tucked tightly, fingers brushing surfaces to stabilize her awareness. She had chosen these spots instinctively, each selection informed by prior experience, each one reinforcing her sense of safety. Everett's chest tightened as he connected these observations with the larger narrative, her whispered plea, the scissors in her hands, the hair she had attempted to manage on her own. The hiding spots were extensions of her emotional strategies, delicate and precise, yet invisible unless someone took the time to look closely. Everett traced the hair tuft with a fingertip without disturbing it, letting his gaze follow the faint path toward the deeper shadow behind the bookshelf. The space beyond suggested another layer of concealment, one that could hold her for extended periods without detection. He noticed dust displaced in subtle arcs along the floor, confirming that her presence had recently passed through the narrow gap between furniture and wall. The meticulous care with which she had navigated these spaces reinforced the urgency of understanding her mindset. These were not merely hiding spots, they were emotional lifelines, fragile sanctuaries that allowed her to regain a sense of stability when the broader mansion threatened overwhelm. He reflected on the mansion's layout, recognizing that its grandeur had unintentionally amplified the necessity of these refuges. High ceilings, long corridors, polished floors, and vast open rooms, though beautiful, had created an environment where subtle distress could go unnoticed for extended periods. The small, hidden corners she claimed had mitigated the psychological weight of space and silence, providing her with opportunities to breathe and recover. Everett's heart tightened as he acknowledged the oversight. His home had offered protection in material terms but had failed to meet the nuanced needs of a child navigating fear, control, and emotional overwhelm. The air around the bookshelf felt cooler, almost as though the space itself absorbed her presence. Everett leaned closer, noting the faint displacement of dust, the subtle shimmer of light catching along the edge of the floorboard, and the small tuft of hair that remained trapped behind the shelf. Each element contributed to a mosaic of evidence, a narrative of repeated visits to the same sanctuary. The details revealed her deliberate selection of spaces, the care she took in arranging herself for maximum comfort, and the depth of her reliance on these tiny refuges to manage overwhelming sensations. Everett's reflection extended beyond the immediate observation. He understood that these hiding spots represented a psychological strategy as much as a physical one. Each corner, each nook, each small gap she had claimed was a controlled environment where she could regulate her emotional response, minimize sensory input, and maintain a semblance of agency. The scattered hair, the residual tug marks, and the deliberate placement of her body all indicated a sophisticated adaptation to circumstances he had failed to monitor or intervene upon. He realized, with increasing urgency, that the sequence of these spaces formed a continuum of movement, her personal map of safety within a home too expansive to monitor continuously. The mansion, once a symbol of order and stability, had unintentionally created zones where a child's needs could remain invisible. Everett's role, moving forward, would be to reconcile the structure of the house with the reality of her experiences, ensuring that she could navigate both emotional and physical environments safely. Behind the bookshelf, a small tuft of her hair remains trapped. Everett's gaze swept the room slowly, noting every small detail he had previously overlooked. Each item she touched carried a story, a trace of the moments she had struggled quietly to manage her discomfort. Brushes lay slightly askew on the dresser, ribbons were twisted into unrecognizable knots, and hair clips were scattered across the floor or tucked into corners in half-hearted attempts at organization. These ordinary objects, which once represented simple daily routines, had been transformed into instruments of coping. They bore the subtle imprint of anxiety, a silent chronicle of the emotional weight she carried. He approached the dresser carefully, aware that any sudden movement might startle her. The top surface was a tableau of subtle distress, strands of hair caught in the bristles of brushes, flattened ribbons that had been repeatedly twisted, and small hair clips pressed into the wood in patterns too precise to be accidental. Each object had been manipulated repeatedly, serving both as a tool for self-soothing and a marker of the stress she experienced within the room. Everett's mind traced her movements, imagining the small hands lifting, adjusting, and sometimes snapping the tools as she attempted to assert control over sensations she could not otherwise influence. The scattered items formed patterns that revealed her thought process. Hair clips aligned along the dress's edge in repeated formations, perhaps for reassurance or as a visual sequence that provided some semblance of order. The ribbons, tied and retied, suggested repetitive motions intended to calm herself, to channel nervous energy into a physical outlet. Brushes, some laden with tiny strands of hair, told the story of repeated attempts to manage discomfort and prevent further frustration. Everett realized that these were not random acts of fidgeting, they were deliberate, if subconscious, strategies for regaining emotional equilibrium within a space that had often felt too overwhelming. As he examined the arrangement further, his attention settled on a particular hairbrush lying across the edge of the dresser. The bristles were worn unevenly, indicating repeated pressure and use in small, precise movements. Nearby, a small bundle of hair had become trapped in the handle, suggesting she had tried to remove it discreetly or test the effectiveness of her own coping attempts. Everett felt the weight of the realization pressing in. Each ordinary item in the room was infused with the marks of her silent struggle, a language expressed without words, understood only through careful observation. His eyes scanned the ribbons and clips again, noting the subtle smudges of color on the polished dresser surface. These smudges were faint but undeniable, evidence of repeated contact over time. The small motions required to adjust the clips or twist the ribbons had left residual impressions, almost like fingerprints of her emotional state. The room itself seemed to record each interaction, creating a permanent record of her attempts to navigate tension and anxiety. The juxtaposition of meticulously arranged furniture with these small, disrupted objects highlighted the delicate balance between order and distress, revealing the layers of struggle hidden beneath the appearance of normalcy. Everett bent slightly, lifting a hair clip to inspect it more closely. The metal clasp was slightly bent, the plastic coating faintly scratched, showing repeated use and minor frustration. He could almost visualize her tiny fingers repeatedly adjusting it, a ritual intended to create some measure of comfort or predictability. Each movement had been a silent communication, a message of discomfort that had gone unnoticed until now. The ordinary items were transformed into conduits of emotion, tools through which she managed sensations she lacked the language to express verbally. The dresser drawer, partially opened, revealed more evidence. Inside lay neatly folded clothes, yet even these were marked subtly by the traces of handling, small creases, slight displacements, and faint imprints of tiny hands searching for reassurance. Everett's eyes lingered on these signs, realizing that the room itself was a living diary of her quiet attempts to regain control over a space that often felt too vast, too structured, and too unyielding. Every object, from the largest brush to the smallest clip, carried the imprint of her coping mechanisms, an intricate web of physical expressions of mental and emotional states. Finally, his gaze fell on the dresser top, where a small comb lay near the edge. Its teeth were broken in a pattern he recognized immediately, deliberate, precise, and repeated. The snapped comb was more than an accident, it was an emblem of frustration, of a small child attempting to exert control over discomfort, and of repeated emotional attempts to manage sensations within her environment. The subtle fracture in the plastic mirrored the vulnerability of her situation, fragile, visible only to those willing to look closely, and profoundly telling of the underlying tension that had remained hidden until this moment. Everett felt the weight of understanding press against him. The ordinary tools of grooming and play had become symbols of resilience, silent channels through which she expressed fear, frustration, and attempts at self-soothing. Each brush, ribbon, and clip told a story of repeated effort, of coping strategies silently developed, and of moments when the world had seemed too overwhelming. The room, with its familiar layout, polished surfaces, and soft lighting, had become a stage for these private rituals, holding within it the cumulative traces of emotional struggle. He knelt slightly to examine the comb more closely, noting the tiny fracture lines that traced across its length. They formed a familiar pattern, a visual record of repeated exertion against frustration, a tangible manifestation of emotional release through physical means. Every crack, every broken tooth, was a testament to the child's struggle to regain control over sensations she could not otherwise manage. Everett's chest tightened as he connected these details with the trajectory of her movements, the scissors in her hands, the strands of hair on the floor, the tug marks on her pillow, and the choice of hiding spots she had navigated with care. The room had become an intricate puzzle, each object contributing a piece of the larger narrative. Brushes and ribbons revealed subtle coping mechanisms. Hair clips indicated deliberate attempts to create order and stability. The snap comb provided a stark, almost painful visual reminder of the intensity of her experience. Everett understood that these items were not merely objects, they were extensions of her emotions, physical translations of fear, discomfort, and resilience. Each element demanded careful attention, observation, and respect to fully comprehend the depth of what she had endured in silence. A snap comb rests on the dresser, its teeth broken in a familiar pattern. Everett stepped back slightly, surveying the room with heightened awareness. The scattered hair strands, displaced furniture, and faint smudges across the polished floor all formed a silent, intricate record of his daughter's recent actions. Each fragment of evidence was a message, a breadcrumb trail of her emotional landscape, conveying a level of vulnerability and resilience that words could not capture. The room, previously neutral and orderly, now bore the weight of her repeated attempts to create comfort in a space that had often felt overwhelming. The hair strands, in particular, acted as both markers of presence and subtle indicators of movement, curving along edges of rugs and skirts of furniture as though she had deliberately guided them into a path only she could navigate. He leaned closer to the floor, tracing the trajectory of the strands with his eyes. Some were short and wispy, clipped or pulled during moments of tension, others were longer, likely tugged in repeated attempts to gain relief from discomfort. The patterns suggested careful consideration, a choreography dictated by instinct and necessity. The furniture, while seemingly undisturbed at first glance, displayed subtle signs of interaction. A chair slightly shifted, a drawer nudged ajar, the rug's edges brushed in arcs consistent with small, methodical movements. Each displacement was a footprint of her need for control, a faint imprint of a child trying to regulate her environment when emotional overwhelm threatened to dominate. Everett's gaze moved from the floor to the baseboards, where faint smudges hinted at fingers brushing against walls for support or stability. These traces were delicate and easily overlooked, yet they spoke volumes. The meticulous care with which she had navigated her surroundings indicated not aimless wandering but deliberate exploration and self-soothing. The mansion, with its expansive rooms, high ceilings, and polished surfaces, magnified every small motion, every subtle sign of stress. The scale of the house had always impressed him, but tonight he saw it through the eyes of a child for whom vastness equaled exposure, and privacy was only available in carefully chosen corners. Each piece of evidence told part of the story. Hair strands mapped a route from the center of the room toward the window, as if she had sought light and orientation. Slightly shifted furniture suggested she had needed to create more intimate spaces within the openness, corners in which she could physically compress herself to feel safer. Dust displaced along the carpet indicated repeated motions, small circular gestures likely meant to soothe tension in a way her young mind understood. Everett recognized a silent code. These were not random traces but purposeful actions signaling discomfort, the need for reassurance, and ultimately, a call for presence from someone who had until now been unaware. He followed the strands further, noting that they converged toward the staircase leading to the attic. The trajectory was subtle but consistent, each movement had left a physical mark in its wake. The hair led across floorboards, around rugs, and past the legs of tables, each step suggesting a careful negotiation with the environment. Everett crouched slightly to observe more closely, noting the faint pressure marks where her small feet had paused or shifted weight. Every detail reinforced the notion that this was not a simple act of play or curiosity, it was a purposeful path, a ritualized route created to navigate emotional tension and find a sense of control in a space that often threatened overwhelm. The trail carried other signs as well. A small throw pillow was slightly displaced from its usual position, likely used as a buffer or barrier against open space. The rug had indentations that suggested repeated adjustments, small shifts to create a more secure area where she could crouch or kneel without feeling exposed. A hairbrush lay near the path, bristles catching faint strands, indicating that she had attempted to manage her own appearance, perhaps as a means of asserting control or as part of a self-soothing routine. These objects, ordinary and overlooked by most, had become instruments through which she expressed anxiety, agency, and emotional regulation. Everett's mind traced back over the events he had already observed. The scissors in her hands, the tug marks on her pillow, and the subtle smudges along walls and furniture all coalesced into a coherent narrative. She had navigated each space in a deliberate sequence, moving from the bedroom to other corners and ultimately toward the attic staircase. Each stop along the route provided a temporary sense of control or relief, a momentary refuge within the larger, overwhelming mansion. Her small, calculated motions created a pattern that, when viewed holistically, revealed both vulnerability and resourcefulness. He noted the attic staircase specifically. The faint edges of light along the steps, the slightly warmer air rising from above, and the consistent direction of hair strands all pointed upward. This was not an arbitrary destination, it was a space she had claimed before, a location where she could gain perspective, safety, and partial isolation. Everett's pulse quickened as he realized the significance. The attic had previously served as a small sanctuary, a place she instinctively returned to when overwhelmed. The physical evidence now clearly indicated that her current path was designed to guide her there once more. He followed the trail carefully with his eyes, noting how the strands of hair, displaced items, and subtle smudges formed a continuous narrative. This pattern spoke of repeated practice, suggesting she had navigated this route before. The repetition indicated both the depth of her need for security and the consistent methods she employed to create it. Each object she interacted with, each subtle trace she left, contributed to a silent story that Everett could now read. The mansion itself, vast and imposing, had shaped these behaviors, magnifying her need to claim personal refuges and orchestrate moments of control within spaces that otherwise felt too expansive. The room's atmosphere shifted slightly as he considered the implications. Shadows from the nightlight stretched along the floor and walls, highlighting the subtle paths she had carved. Dust particles glimmered faintly in the light, catching along the edges of the rug where her hands or knees had brushed. Everett realized that the mansion had become both a stage and a repository for her silent expressions of fear and coping. The objects and spaces she interacted with were not merely passive, they carried the imprints of her strategies, her need for containment, and her careful, deliberate attempts to navigate a world that often felt too vast for her small body and fragile psyche. He reached the base of the attic staircase, noting the convergence of the hair strands, displaced objects, and subtle environmental cues. The path was unmistakable. The child had moved deliberately, using every element of the room to guide herself toward a familiar sanctuary. Everett's chest tightened with both understanding and urgency. He now recognized the trajectory of her distress, the rhythm of her attempts to seek comfort, and the spaces she had claimed along the way. The room had revealed its secrets in small, precise ways, and the trail continued upward, beckoning him to follow. A trail of hair leads toward the attic staircase. Everett's eyes followed the faint trail of hair and displaced items up the narrow attic staircase. The air grew slightly warmer and more stagnant with each step, carrying the faint scent of dust, old wood, and faint traces of fabric. The attic, long considered a storage space for forgotten belongings, now revealed itself as a refuge. The faint light filtering through the small dormer windows illuminated crates, boxes, and stacks of old blankets, but the real focus was the open spaces she had claimed for herself. In the dimness, her presence was palpable, a small, deliberate occupation of space designed to contain pain, regulate breath, and create a sense of control in a world that often felt too large. He paused at the top step, scanning the cluttered environment. Crates of holiday decorations, books long forgotten, and old toys formed natural barriers and corners she could slip into, tucking herself safely away. The attic's sloped ceilings compressed the air, creating a sense of enclosure that mirrored the safe corners she had occupied throughout the mansion. Everett noticed the careful arrangement of her blankets near one corner, layered to create a soft, insulated pocket where she could curl herself, hiding not just her body but the turmoil that had built over days or weeks of subtle distress. The space was small, intimate, and perfectly suited to a child seeking control in an overwhelming environment. The blankets bore subtle indentations, small valleys shaped by her tiny frame. Everett imagined her curling inside, pulling him close to her chest, pressing against the comforting textures, and finding temporary reprieve from the tension that had accumulated throughout the mansion. The soft folds of fabric, worn smooth from repeated use, indicated the care she had taken in selecting the most comforting materials. Her strategy was deliberate: choose a space confined enough to feel protected, use textures to stabilize sensory perception, and remain unnoticed until the immediate threat of overwhelm passed. Around the blankets, Everett noticed other signs of her presence. Small hair strands clung to the edges of the rug, and faint smudges on wooden crate corners marked where her hands had pressed for stability. Even the dust in the air carried traces of her subtle movements, stirred by shifts in posture or the careful adjustment of blankets. Every detail painted a vivid picture. She had moved with care, negotiating the attic's confined space in patterns that ensured both concealment and comfort. This was not a random choice. It was a calculated attempt to manage internal anxiety within the physical constraints of the environment. Everett's gaze traveled to a corner of the attic partially hidden by stacked boxes. There, he noticed the small shadows where objects had been shifted, creating narrow passages and protective alcoves. He realized that she had been moving carefully within these boundaries, using the space to regulate herself emotionally. The environment, though cluttered and dusty, had been transformed into a network of safety zones tailored precisely to her needs. Everett could almost feel her tiny heartbeat as he considered the meticulous attention she had given to the arrangement of her temporary sanctuary. The attic's quietness contrasted sharply with the underlying tension of the night. Shadows stretched along the sloped ceiling, highlighting both the safety of her chosen corner and the fragility of her positioning. Everett's awareness of the room intensified. Every blanket fold, every displaced box, every stray hair strand became a marker of her emotional state. He understood that these were not signs of mischief or play, they were patterns of survival. The child had transformed the storage space into a carefully curated refuge, a personal haven that allowed her to breathe, recalibrate, and maintain some sense of agency over a world that had felt overwhelmingly large. He leaned closer, careful not to disturb the carefully structured area. Each movement revealed further signs of intentional behavior. The edges of the blankets had been tucked in along the floor, forming protective boundaries. The small folds created subtle ridges where she had rested her head or pressed her hands. These delicate impressions were markers of repeated use, of deliberate engagement with the space to achieve calm. Everett could almost visualize the sequence of her actions, moving into the corner, adjusting blankets, curling up, and finally clutching familiar items that offered both comfort and a sense of safety. In that corner, the subtle traces of personal items, tiny toys, scraps of cloth, and a few hair clips, reinforced the deliberate nature of her refuge. Everett understood that these objects were part of the emotional scaffolding she had created, each item chosen to provide tactile reassurance or familiarity. The attic, long neglected as a storage space, had become a critical environment for her mental and emotional well-being. The organization, intentional or otherwise, reflected a child's instinct to impose order in spaces where she could exercise control and minimize unpredictability. Everett's gaze shifted slightly and froze. A small pair of scissors lay abandoned near one of the folded blankets. The metallic reflection caught the faint attic light, drawing his attention immediately. The scissors were not in her hands this time, they were discarded deliberately, positioned beside the blanket as if she had completed a ritual of control and self-expression. Everett's mind raced as he considered the significance. The object had been a tool, a shield, and a marker of distress, now left behind to signal both her presence and the intensity of the emotional journey that had brought her here. The scissors, resting quietly, were almost symbolic. They represented the culmination of her struggle to assert control and communicate fear in a language she could manage. Everett recognized the significance instantly. The path, the environment, the objects, and the careful placement of items had all been orchestrated by her need to feel safe. The attic corner had become a sanctuary, a controlled environment where she could regulate sensory input, manage emotional overwhelm, and gain temporary reprieve from the stresses of the wider house. The traces of her presence, subtle yet deliberate, formed a complete narrative of resilience, vulnerability, and calculated self-protection. Everett's chest tightened as he absorbed the full picture. Every trace, hair strands, blanket folds, displaced objects, and the scissors, told a story of deliberate coping and quiet struggle. The child had converted a forgotten corner into a refuge of agency, a private sanctuary where she could exist without judgment or interference. Every movement, every decision, every object placement was evidence of her ingenuity and her instinctive need to find safety within the chaos of a house too large for a young child to navigate emotionally without guidance. A small pair of scissors lies abandoned near a blanket. Everett studied the attic corner carefully, taking in every small detail she had left behind. Each tug of a blanket, each snip of hair, every displaced object revealed a narrative of fear, discomfort, and quiet resilience. Her actions were not random, they were deliberate, subtle expressions of emotions she could not articulate with words. The scissors, the scattered strands of hair, the carefully folded blankets, they were all messages embedded in the physical environment, fragments of communication through movement, arrangement, and restraint. Everett realized that the child's language had been silent, physical, and precise, requiring a patient and attentive observer to decode. He traced the path of her small, calculated movements across the attic floor. Dust displaced along the edges of boxes showed the direction of her travel, while faint impressions on the floorboards marked where she had paused, crouched, or shifted her weight. Each stop indicated a moment of decision, a careful choice to create safety and stability in an environment that had felt overwhelming. Everett observed how she had used familiar objects, small toys, hair clips, folded blankets, not only for comfort but also to mark spaces she could trust. These items carried the imprint of her emotional needs, forming a vocabulary of subtle cues that described both fear and coping strategies. The scissors, now resting near the blankets, symbolized more than her immediate distress. Their careful placement suggested a deliberate act of signaling, a way to mark her territory while simultaneously communicating her vulnerability. Everett understood that her manipulation of the scissors had been a conscious attempt to translate internal anxiety into a visible, tangible form. In her world, the ordinary tools of grooming and play had become instruments of self-expression, each object chosen to provide a sense of control, however fleeting. The patterns she created were layered with meaning, a silent story waiting to be read. Everett's eyes moved to the edges of the blankets and the surrounding boxes. He noticed subtle indentations and shifted surfaces that marked repeated use. Small creases on folded fabrics, a slightly tilted box, even a faint smear of dust on a shelf, all were signals of a child navigating fear in the absence of verbal communication. Each gesture communicated what she could not speak, the desire to be understood, the need for comfort, and the instinct to protect herself in a world that had often felt too large and unmanageable. The attic, dimly lit and quiet, had become a canvas for her silent, methodical expression. He carefully examined a small set of hair clips near the corner. Their arrangement was deliberate. Some were pressed flat against the surface, while others were stacked or positioned along the edge of the box. These clips were more than tools. They were markers, possibly a code she had established for herself to organize her environment and manage sensory input. Everett realized that each placement, each minor adjustment, indicated careful attention to detail, suggesting both anxiety and an innate need to structure her surroundings to feel safe. Her small hands had left a record of her emotional state, a map that traced her attempts to exert control over spaces that were otherwise overwhelming. His attention then shifted to a low crate near the blankets, where the dust showed repeated smudges. The marks were delicate yet deliberate, revealing small gestures of self-soothing, tracing lines, pressing fingers into soft surfaces, or brushing away stray strands of hair. Everett's chest tightened as he recognized the repetitive nature of these actions. They were not accidental. The motions had a rhythm, an intentionality designed to provide temporary relief, a physical anchor in a world that felt too vast and unpredictable. Every object she touched became part of this emotional lexicon, each item a letter, each gesture a word. Everett observed the floor near the far corner and noticed faint streaks of hair leading toward the attic window. This trail suggested she had moved deliberately from one secure point to another, testing boundaries while seeking comfort. The combination of hair, displaced objects, and subtle marks in the dust created a coherent narrative of movement, emotional processing, and repeated attempts at self-regulation. The attic was no longer merely a room. It had become a stage for a silent drama, one in which she communicated in actions, physical traces, and strategic positioning. As he bent closer to inspect the details, Everett noticed something partially hidden beneath a folded blanket. He reached carefully and discovered a small notebook, its edges frayed and pages slightly worn. Each page contained tiny illustrations, faint sketches of herself, the scissors, blankets, and scattered hair, as well as abstract lines that seemed to map movement, emotion, and space. The drawings were methodical, almost obsessive, capturing the minutiae of her experience and the intensity of her fear. Everett understood immediately. The notebook was her most deliberate form of communication, an attempt to document feelings she could not verbalize and to create a record of her coping strategies within a world that had often failed to notice her distress. The illustrations revealed layers of emotional depth. Simple depictions of curled forms suggested self-protection. Repeated motifs of objects and spaces indicated a methodical attempt to maintain control over her environment. Lines and angles reflected tension, while clustered symbols showed repeated efforts to mitigate discomfort. Everett's heart tightened as he realized the complexity of her inner world, captured through actions and now translated visually onto paper. Each stroke of pencil and each deliberate mark was a cry for understanding, a plea that he could finally see and interpret. He placed the notebook carefully back among the blankets, conscious not to disturb the fragile traces of her presence. The attic, dim and quiet, now radiated with significance. Each object, each mark in the dust, each fragment of hair, and every carefully drawn page in the notebook formed an interconnected language, a narrative that detailed her experiences, fears, and strategies for finding comfort. Everett recognized that understanding this language was critical. The room itself had become both refuge and messenger, carrying the silent story of a child's struggle in a world she could not yet fully navigate alone. Every element, the blankets, the boxes, the hair, the smudges, the notebook, and the abandoned scissors, intertwined to create a tapestry of emotional expression. Everett felt a growing sense of responsibility to translate these messages into action, to bridge the gap between her silent signals and his presence. He understood, finally, that every subtle trace of her behavior was deliberate and communicative, offering insight into her inner world if only he chose to interpret it carefully. The attic had become a map, a diary, and a sanctuary all at once, holding the evidence of a child's silent, enduring resilience. A notebook filled with tiny illustrations captures her inner turmoil. Everett stood in the attic, the notebook and abandoned scissors still visible in the faint glow from the small window. A clarity washed over him, sudden, precise, and undeniable. His daughter's whispered plea, the trembling hands clutching scissors, the scattered hair strands, and the meticulous arrangement of objects were no longer merely signs of mischief or discomfort. They were expressions of a deeper, more complex need, control, comfort, and the management of fear in a world that had often seemed too vast and unpredictable. For the first time, Everett saw the full weight of what she had endured, and he realized that every action, every object, every trace in the attic was a deliberate attempt to communicate in the only language she could rely upon, actions instead of words. He reflected on the path she had carved throughout the mansion, from her bedroom to the attic, noting how each step had been an orchestrated attempt to regain agency. Her small hands had manipulated objects carefully, leaving behind subtle cues that revealed her inner state. The scattered hair, tug marks, displaced blankets, and faint smudges of dust all formed a cohesive message. She had been struggling to create order and comfort for herself in an environment that had felt uncontrollable at times. The scissors, once seen as a potential danger, now emerged as symbolic tools of self-expression, a method through which she exerted tiny measures of control over her surroundings. Everett's heart ached as he considered how often he had misinterpreted her behavior. He had seen strands of hair on the floor or an out-of-place clip and thought them trivial. He had assumed the quiet of her rooms meant contentment, but now he understood that each minor disruption had been a sign of distress, a plea for intervention that had gone unheeded. Her actions were deliberate, strategic, and poignant, an emotional code designed to preserve her sense of agency and to maintain comfort in a world that otherwise felt overwhelming. Her suffering was not dramatic, not loud, but it was profound, articulated through an intricate network of physical signals. The attic itself reinforced the clarity of this understanding. The confined space, dim lighting, and tactile materials she had arranged were integral to her coping strategy. Each blanket, pillow, and stack of boxes was chosen to reduce stimuli, create comfort, and provide a sense of control over her immediate environment. Everett recognized that this sanctuary was not random, it was an intentional, adaptive response to the emotional challenges of the mansion. The spatial arrangements, the careful selection of textures, and the subtle positioning of objects revealed a sophisticated, instinctive understanding of her own needs, reflecting resilience and intelligence in the face of distress. He examined the notebook once more, the pages filled with tiny illustrations that documented her experiences. Each sketch was deliberate, lines traced movement, objects, and the placement of her hands. Small figures depicted herself, the scissors, and the blankets, creating a visual language that conveyed the depth of her fear and the steps she had taken to protect herself. Everett realized that these drawings were more than records, they were her way of translating the intangible into something visible, a method of communicating control and comfort when words were insufficient. Every mark, every figure, and every symbol was imbued with meaning, revealing the layered complexity of her emotional world. In this moment, Everett understood the full scope of her plea, "My hair hurts, please." It was not a complaint about vanity or appearance. It was a profound declaration of need, an articulation of the desire to exert control over one aspect of her body in a house that often felt too large and chaotic. The discomfort extended beyond physical sensation. It represented her attempt to navigate emotional overwhelm, establish boundaries, and secure a sense of personal safety. Her whispered words were the tip of a much larger narrative, now fully illuminated through the trail of objects, hair, and illustrations she had left behind. Everett's chest tightened as he traced the path she had taken to the attic. The sequence of her movements formed a coherent story of resilience and adaptation. She had moved deliberately, selecting corners and small spaces to manage sensory input and maintain emotional equilibrium. Each choice, from the bedroom to the attic, reflected her acute awareness of her environment and her need for sanctuary. The objects she touched, the hair strands she manipulated, and the drawings she created formed an intricate language, a method of expressing distress and self-soothing simultaneously. As he took a step forward, intending to engage gently, Everett noticed something alarming. The attic corner where he expected her to be was empty. The blankets remained folded with subtle impressions, the notebook rested in its place, and the scissors lay abandoned as before, but the small body that had claimed this refuge was no longer present. The absence was immediate, palpable, and disorienting. Every clue he had pieced together pointed to her deliberate use of space as a sanctuary, yet now that sanctuary was vacant, leaving only traces and echoes of her presence. The realization hit with an intensity that made the room feel impossibly large, even with its sloped ceilings and cozy corners. Everett's pulse quickened. The child who had meticulously carved a path of comfort and control was suddenly out of sight. Every indication of her presence, from the hair on the floor to the carefully arranged objects, was now a map without a destination. He understood that she had moved on, seeking another refuge, perhaps another corner in the mansion that had previously offered her relief. The clarity of her need for control and comfort was now compounded by the urgency to locate her before she experienced further distress or isolation. He scanned the attic thoroughly, moving cautiously to avoid disturbing the delicate evidence of her presence. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the faint light filtering through the small window, and every box, blanket, and object became a potential marker or barrier. The silent narrative she had constructed was interrupted only by her absence, leaving him with the understanding of her emotional landscape but no immediate way to connect physically. The attic had communicated her needs with precision, yet it had also demonstrated her ability to retreat swiftly, further emphasizing the delicate balance between safety and vulnerability in her world. The weight of realization pressed heavily on Everett. He had finally understood the meaning behind her words, the significance of her actions, and the sophistication of her coping mechanisms. But now, he faced a new challenge, her absence. The clarity of her communication had arrived too late to ensure immediate comfort, and the child whose needs he had finally understood was now navigating spaces beyond his immediate perception. The mansion, previously a backdrop to his assumptions of safety, now demanded his vigilance in ways he had never anticipated. The little girl is no longer in the attic where he expected her. Everett moved through the mansion with a heightened awareness, his senses attuned to the smallest details that might reveal her presence. Every object, every shadow, and every subtle change in the air could be a clue, a breadcrumb left behind by a child navigating her world with quiet precision. Hair strands clung faintly to the edges of rugs, accessories lay slightly displaced, and dust on shelves and windowsills bore the soft impressions of small hands brushing against them. Each trace was evidence of movement, of a deliberate path forged to seek comfort, and of the complex choreography of a child attempting to navigate a house that had often felt too vast. The polished floors, which had always reflected light and order, now served as a canvas for the tiny, almost imperceptible signs of her journey. Everett's eyes followed faint streaks of hair that curved along floorboards, around furniture legs, and along baseboards. The strands marked pauses and hesitations, indicating where she had stopped to assess safety or regain composure. He noted the careful placement of small objects along her route, objects nudged or rearranged in ways that suggested they were part of a protective routine. Even the dust on a low table bore subtle smudges, a record of delicate hands brushing across surfaces to provide reassurance or stability. Everett's pace slowed as he moved into the hallways, scanning corners and spaces that had once seemed insignificant. He examined gaps beneath doors, the shadowed edges of furniture, and the spaces behind curtains, recognizing that she had likely used these areas for brief refuge. The mansion, with its sprawling layout and high ceilings, had provided both opportunities and challenges for her. Every step she took was carefully calculated, a negotiation with the vastness of her environment, the silence of empty rooms, and the sensory stimuli that she could not always control. The mansion itself had become a maze of safety zones and danger zones, with her actions mapping a network of hidden paths that required patience and observation to interpret. He paused near the foyer, where the faint gleam of moonlight highlighted slight disturbances on the carpet. The hair on the floor formed a subtle, continuous line leading toward the staircase. Accessories, small hair clips, and a displaced ribbon suggested her careful movement as she transitioned from one corner to another. Everett's heart tightened as he noted the precision of her journey, every action intentional, every pause significant, every minor alteration of objects a form of communication and self-soothing. She had been leaving a trail that could only be understood by someone willing to slow down, look closely, and interpret the subtle language she had developed. Moving further into the mansion, Everett's eyes caught the faintest disturbance along the hallway walls. Dust had been brushed lightly, likely by tiny hands searching for guidance, support, or stability. A chair was slightly shifted, and a rug near the stairwell bore small impressions indicating repeated pauses. Everett bent slightly to examine these traces, understanding that each micro-movement told a story. The mansion, once a neutral backdrop, now revealed itself as a landscape that had shaped her coping mechanisms, providing small shelters, obstacles, and markers along her path. Every detail, no matter how minute, contributed to a narrative he was only beginning to comprehend. As he continued, he noted the air felt slightly warmer near the base of the staircase, a subtle cue of her recent passage. Everett followed the rising heat, observing faint hair strands and tiny smudges leading toward a narrow, shadowed space beneath the stairs. The patterns were deliberate, strands forming gentle curves, the slight misalignment of objects, and the faint displacements in dust all indicated her methodical, calculated approach. Each step demonstrated both her vulnerability and her ingenuity, a child carefully orchestrating movement to maintain a sense of control in spaces she could manage physically and emotionally. Everett's gaze traveled across small objects along the hallway. A hairbrush lay slightly askew, a ribbon had fallen from its typical storage spot, and a faint fingerprint appeared on the corner of a low table. Each detail reinforced the ongoing story. She had moved through these areas, adjusting her environment in ways designed to foster comfort and predictability. Everett understood that these micro-actions, often overlooked by adults, were integral to her survival strategies. They were intentional, and they required interpretation, observation, and patience to fully grasp. The staircase leading to the basement caught his attention next. Faint disturbances along the floorboards suggested cautious exploration, with pauses indicated by subtle changes in dust patterns and impressions in rugs. Everett's gaze tracked each detail, realizing that she had used the floor, the walls, and the furniture as guides to navigate safely. Every subtle trace of movement demonstrated the intricate balance between fear and agency, between anxiety and self-regulation. The mansion, expansive and imposing, had inadvertently fostered these hidden paths, forcing her to adapt in ways both clever and necessary. As he descended the staircase to the landing near the hidden space beneath the stairs, Everett slowed his breathing to avoid disturbing the delicate traces she had left behind. The light was dim, shadows pooling in corners, but the signs of her presence were unmistakable. Hair strands, faint scuff marks, and the subtle alignment of objects all indicated recent movement. Everett's pulse quickened as he recognized the precision of her journey, the care she had taken to remain unseen, and the emotional intelligence embedded in every step. She had transformed an ordinary architectural feature, a space beneath the stairs, into a temporary refuge, relying on its shadows and containment to feel protected. Everett crouched closer to the base of the stairs, careful not to disturb the traces of her presence. Dust had been lightly brushed along the floor, small hair strands curved along edges, and objects were slightly displaced in ways that suggested recent, deliberate occupation. The air carried a faint warmth, evidence of proximity to her body, and Everett could feel the tension radiating from the space itself. Each subtle cue indicated that she had recently been there, moving with care to maintain her own comfort, safety, and sense of control. Finally, a sound reached his ears, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle from the hidden space beneath the stairs. The faint disturbance in the shadows suggested movement, though minimal, as if she had shifted slightly in response to his presence or to assess the safety of her surroundings. Everett froze, holding his breath, recognizing that this tiny signal was far more significant than words or shouts. It was a confirmation of life, a subtle acknowledgement that she was still present, still navigating the mansion with deliberate intention. Every trace he had followed led to this point, and the rustle was the final, tangible proof that his careful attention had brought him within reach of her hidden sanctuary. A soft rustle comes from the hidden space beneath the stairs. Everett crouched at the base of the stairs, his eyes finally settling on the small figure huddled in the cramped corner beneath the dark shadowed alcove. She was curled tightly, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped protectively around a few hair clips she clutched like shields of safety. Every movement, every slight tremor in her posture conveyed both vulnerability and the instinctive need to preserve control over her immediate world. The faint glow from the hallway light cast delicate highlights along her dark brown hair and the edges of her small pajamas, emphasizing the fragility of her frame and the intensity of the fear she had carried alone for so long. The space itself, narrow and shadowed, seemed to embrace her, providing the sense of containment she had sought throughout the mansion. Everett could see how the shadows pooled around her body, creating a cocoon of relative safety. Even the floor beneath her bore the traces of her repeated adjustments, faint indentations in the rug, slight smudges of dust, and tiny strands of hair marking her path to this refuge. Each detail told a story of movement, struggle, and survival. She had chosen this particular corner deliberately, relying on the constraints of the space to regulate her emotions, offering herself the control she had been denied in the larger expanse of the house. Everett's chest tightened as he absorbed the magnitude of her reliance on these small items. The hair clips, carefully held, were more than tools. They were talismans of safety, extensions of her desire for agency in an environment that had frequently overwhelmed her. His mind traced the trajectory of the night, from the scattered hair in her bedroom, to the carefully arranged blankets in the attic, to the trail that had led him here beneath the stairs. Every micro-movement, every displaced object, every trace of interaction was part of a narrative he had only just begun to read. She had communicated in ways far subtler than words could capture, and he now understood the depth of what had been missed. As he leaned closer, maintaining a cautious and deliberate presence, he observed the rhythm of her breathing. Short, uneven, hesitant, it reflected the tension of a body bracing for the world, a heart preparing for the worst even as it yearned for reassurance. Her eyes, wide and luminous, darted briefly toward his approaching form, then returned to clutching the small objects, signaling a mix of anticipation, distrust, and fragile hope. Everett realized that this delicate balance, between fear and the faint possibility of comfort, was entirely in his hands. His approach, measured yet perceptible, could either reinforce her sense of safety or push her further into protective retreat. The air beneath the stairs was heavy with silence, punctuated only by her faint tremors and the distant echoes of the mansion's hallways. Everett's gaze swept the small area surrounding her, noting subtle traces of prior presence, a small smudge on the wall where her fingers had pressed, a light impression on the floor from her knees, and scattered items that marked a careful attempt to create a personal domain within the constrained space. The combination of these indicators revealed not just fear, but an intricate system of self-regulation and coping that had been employed repeatedly. Each object, mark, and posture had a precise purpose in her internal strategy to maintain stability amidst anxiety. Everett's mind traced back across the night's events, the scattered hair, the tugged blankets, the attic refuge, and the notebook filled with delicate illustrations, all now converging in this moment. He understood fully that her actions were part of a continuum, a calculated series of movements and adjustments designed to assert control, maintain comfort, and protect herself from sensations and experiences that she had not yet been able to verbalize. Every inch of space, every object, every trace of her presence was part of a carefully constructed world that demanded attentive observation and sensitive response. He took a slow, deliberate breath, measuring his movements and the proximity of his body. His shadow stretched across the floor toward her, a gentle presence rather than an imposing figure. The light caught the edges of her small hair clips, glinting faintly, marking the boundary between fear and fragile trust. Everett understood that this was not a moment for hurried gestures, rushed comfort, or attempts to force interaction. Instead, it was a moment of patient acknowledgement, a careful bridging of distance between adult understanding and child instinct. The smallest misstep could disrupt the tenuous sense of safety she had painstakingly constructed. Everett's attention focused on the subtle cues of her posture. Her knees remained drawn tightly, her arms around the hair clips, shoulders hunched protectively. The slight tilt of her head suggested attentiveness mingled with caution. Her gaze flicked briefly toward him, then returned to clutching the objects as if they were a lifeline. Every movement spoke volumes. The child was signaling readiness for connection, but only on her own terms. He understood that the act of observing, of acknowledging her space and presence, was the first critical step toward rebuilding trust. The attic and the hidden corners of the mansion had offered her refuge in previous hours, but this space beneath the stairs now carried an intensity all its own. Everett recognized it as both a sanctuary and a stage for vulnerability. He studied the objects surrounding her, the few scattered hair clips, the folds of fabric, the faint imprints on the floor, and realized that each element had been intentionally preserved to maintain a sense of security. The physical markers of her coping strategy were as significant as her breathing, her posture, or the subtle expressions of her face. Together, they formed a delicate ecosystem of comfort and control. Everett reached forward slowly, careful to keep his hands open, visible, and non-threatening. Every muscle in his body was attuned to her responses. The rustling of blankets, the faint twitch of fingers, the glimmer of wide eyes reflected anticipation, readiness, and cautious hope. His mind calculated the balance between movement and stillness, action and restraint. The child's world, meticulously constructed in this small alcove, required sensitivity, respect, and unwavering focus to navigate successfully. Everett's role in this fragile moment was no longer as a distant guardian, but as a participant in her emotional ecosystem, where trust could either be rebuilt or shattered. He inhaled slowly, aware that this was the culmination of the night's journey. Every trail of hair, every tug mark, every object left in her wake had led to this precise moment. Everett understood the stakes. The next action, the next subtle gesture, and the first carefully chosen words would determine whether the fragile bridge of trust between father and daughter could hold or whether fear would dominate once more. He leaned just slightly closer, maintaining a deliberate distance that allowed her autonomy while signaling his presence and willingness to protect. The child remained curled in her corner, hair clips pressed tightly to her chest, eyes alert yet quivering. Everett's gaze softened, reflecting recognition of the depth of her endurance, the sophistication of her coping strategies, and the intensity of her fear. The room, once a hidden refuge, had become the decisive point of reconciliation between her isolated world and his engagement as a parent. The mansion, with all its sprawling corridors, high ceilings, and previous oversight, had funneled her into this space. Now, Everett's choices would define the trajectory of her sense of safety moving forward. The next words he says will decide whether trust is rebuilt, or fear takes hold again. Everett finally reaches his daughter, curled in a cramped corner, clutching hair clips as shields of comfort. He realizes every trace, scattered hair, tugged blankets, and tiny objects, was her silent plea for understanding. The mansion, vast and imposing, had amplified her fear, but his presence now begins to rebuild her sense of safety. In this fragile moment, trust and fear hang in delicate balance, shaped entirely by his next careful actions. He knows that one wrong move could push her further into isolation, but one gentle choice can bring her back into his world. Every trace she left tells a story. Don't let it go unseen. Let someone else uncover the mystery too. Her silent struggle deserves to be noticed, and your click could guide others to see it in full. Stay close, more secrets, more revelations, and more hidden truths await in the next story. Quick question before you leave: which country are you watching this from? It might change how you see everything. And remember, the next action you take could be the one that uncovers what she's been silently protecting all along.